Sir, I want to begin by thanking all of those who have made today possible, all those who have engaged in the consultations and scrutiny processes, my committee colleagues and all in this place, MSPs and staff, who have contributed to this important legislation. Mostly, I want to thank trans people who have put up with delay, abuse, loss and grief. Today is for you. I stand here this afternoon with a multitude of mixed feelings of relief, anticipation, frustration and sorrow. Sorrow that the 6 years of work on this bill, arduous work, undergone most of all by trans people themselves, has taken place in an increasingly toxic environment, a miasma of intensifying myths about this bill, about gender recognition, about wider aspects of trans people's lives, and about the motivations of those of us who stand in solidarity and love as their unshakable allies. Many of these myths are not only mistaken, but entirely irrelevant to the bill before us today. A gender recognition certificate is not a route to medical transition, nor vice versa. They are entirely separate processes. Indeed, demedicalisation is a key principle of this bill. So there is no place for those conspiracy theories of big pharma, of child mutilation. They are not only so bitterly ironic in the context of trans healthcare, underinvestment, multi-year waiting lists, but they are also false in both outline and detail, deliberately disseminated to mislead and muddy the waters. I stand in frustration at the gaps in this legislation, gaps which our best endeavours have not yet been able to fill. Sex is not, as some would like to imagine, binary and immutable. That is why, as soon as possible, I and the Scottish Greens are determined to see comprehensive gender recognition for non-binary people in Scotland. You are not forgotten. There is a second gap, those under 16, for whom formal gender recognition would both be appropriate and beneficial. I will continue to work for this, for trans children everywhere. I am saddened that the amendments I tabled at stage 2 were not supported. Those on the removal of waiting times and of the new criminal offence of making a false declaration, those clarifying and limiting the power of third parties to seek revocation of a GRC and providing penalties where those applications are malicious or vexatious. I'm disappointed because these represent international best practice and, most importantly, the needs and experiences of trans people themselves, whose voices have not been sufficiently heard above the clamour of noisy opposition. And I am deeply unhappy that, despite resisting the most horrendous amendments this week, this bill now includes provisions that I can only describe as dog whistles. Such messages in legislation can never make for good law, for they both create and legitimise the context of hate and fear in which, heartbreakingly, trans people are obliged to live. There is nothing new here. Every time that a group of marginalised people comes close to achieving their rights, emerges from the fog of condescension and ridicule through which they have previously been seen, the same story is told. The story about the need to protect women and children, especially girls, from some new and insidious threat. It has never been true, and we look back with collective shame at the way that our society has been duped by it. And in exactly the same way, we will look back at this moral panic with deep regret. The myths being spread about this bill follow those old patterns with depressing precision. Yet we are far from the first country to carry out this reform, which applies to populations of many hundreds of millions, and nowhere that has gone before has experienced any of the scenarios hinted at by the bill's opponents. That's no surprise, because those scenarios simply don't make any sense. Women and girls are indeed vulnerable to predatory attack, as trans women know better than most. But no potential attacker needs a GRC to play their power games. Our society is based on self-identification. From the time we are born until the time we die, we, or someone on our behalf, tells the world who we are, where we live, what we earn, what name, what faith, what national identity we recognise as our own. There are penalties for untruths, just as in this legislation. But the fundamental understanding is that we each, better than anyone else, know who we are. And finally, those long years have shown that there is no bright line between people who claim to support trans rights, but in practice oppose every step towards them, and those who view all trans people as fraudulent or at best deluded. In the spectrum of trans myths, the most extreme the most extreme provide a kind of invisible ballast for the mainstream. But they are still myths, still toxic, still untrue. As the great feminist Judith Butler has written of this movement, they assemble and launch incendiary claims to defeat us by any rhetorical means necessary. In closing, I too want to bring the words of a trans person to this chamber. We've spent many hours talking about trans people. Let's hear them. And I quote, "It's a scary world for trans people at the moment. My family were initially supportive, but we moved my mum to live nearer to us recently and realised that she is now a TERF. It's a sign of things going on in the rest of the world. She talks about how trans people are predatory and are going to go into toilets to commit sexual assaults. I remember the repeal of Section 28, and this is what it feels like we are demonised by society and are portrayed as threats, and people with loud voices on social media and in mainstream media are saying that we want this to sexually assault people. There is so much very loud hate and demonisation, but we are people." End quote. So, Presiding Officer, we will not be defeated. Not today, not in the months and years to come. We have a choice now to stand in the miasma of scaremongering myth or to step into the sunlight with our trans siblings. I choose to step into that sunlight and vote for this bill. Thank you.